Thanks, Tom. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to be relatively quick, you'll be pleased to hear. I suppose I'm just going to talk briefly and give you an overview of what we're going to cover in the day, but also I suppose it's very much a time for me to be introduced to you. I haven't had the opportunity to meet many of you up until this point, so I wanted to learn from you here today in terms of some of the issues coming up in relation to the law as it's being introduced. I wanted to also thank Eversheds who are helping us and supporting us in running this event here today. In terms of what we're going to try and cover today is we're going to give an overview of kind of what the landlord and tenant law is. As Tom has just referred to there, we have a very diverse group of stakeholders in the room today, so a lot of you will already have a knowledge of the law in this area, but some others won't. So forgive us if we indulge in terms of going backwards a bit for some people and going back to first principles. But then we will concentrate very much on what are the new provisions that have come in terms of the Residential Tenancies Act of 2015. And then we're going to move on to the whole issue of dispute prevention and resolution, and then allow some time for questions and answers. I suppose I'm very cognizant, just before moving off that point, that it is a time of great change for landlords and tenants in the sector, and the changes that have come in a phase basis. And I suppose what we're trying to do today is to try and make sure that everybody now knows what's in and what does it mean, and what does that mean now that I have to do. So that's kind of the purpose in terms of what we're trying to get to today. In terms of, I suppose Tom just mentioned it, before we start, maybe the first thing to mention is we've changed our name. So we're now the Residential Tenancies Board. We've dropped the P, and that's the P for the Private Residential Tenancies Board, and that's because we have approved housing bodies, or housing associations, as many people will know them as, now under the remit of the Residential Tenancies Board since April. That's a really important change. It's an important change not only because it extends our sector to another 30,000 or so tenants, but because those tenants now have the same rights and obligations, and the landlords have the same rights and obligations as the rental sector overall. So we're moving from a private rental sector to a rental sector, and stopping that distinction between social and private tenants. So we're moving more towards a European model of housing where we just talk about the rental sector. And I think it's a really important point to make. Since I've come into the job, I suppose a lot of people say, well, what is the RTB? What does it do? How many staff have you got? And it's a constant question. So indulge me while I just briefly go through a little bit about what we do and our numbers. So the overall vision of the Residential Tenancies Board is to be a well-functioning rental housing sector in Ireland that is fair, accessible and beneficial for all. In the current environment, obviously, that's an extremely challenging vision for us to have, and I'm going to come back to that later in terms of how and what do the RTB do to try and support that. But our main functions are, I suppose, as the regulator for the sector, to register all landlord and all tenancies, to provide a dispute resolution service, but also to provide data on the sector, so like our rent index. So we're the people who have most of the knowledge about what's going on in the rental sector, and we have a duty, I suppose, to provide that data on the sector, and also to advise, I suppose, the Minister where there's operational issues with the legislation. In terms of numbers, we have 324,000 tenancies currently registered with us. That is encompassing over 705,000 occupants within the sector and 172,000 landlords. We currently have 40 staff supporting us in terms of delivering our services, with sanction for a further 10. So that's the type of numbers that we have in our offices. We have a budget of circa about 12 million. And in terms of our adjudication, so if there's a dispute, our adjudication and mediation services, we have 32 independent adjudicator and mediators and 45 tribunal members where our appeals go. And before, we're supported by our board and also by external services providers. So we have a contact centre that deals with a lot of our communications via email, but also via telephone and so on. And then we also have legal advisors such as Eversheds and IT supports. In terms of what's been happening with the sector, again, a common question is where are we at with the disputes? There's a constant theme that people kind of expect that our disputes, because of what the housing market is currently like, are huge and that they've gone way, way up. And yes, if you look at that curve, I'm not going to go into the numbers, if you look at the graph, the numbers of disputes have gone way, way up. And we had over 4,000 applications in terms of disputes last year. but they only make up 1 to 2% of registered tenancies. So as you go through that graph, it's always the same. It's always sitting there between 1 to 2% of tenancies. So while the numbers of disputes has gone up, that's a representation of the growth of the sector rather than a change in terms of the number of disputes that are coming to us in terms of pro rata to the number of tenancies. How does that come into being in terms of our operations? Well, a good proportion of those cases are resolved before we ever get to a hearing. That's through sometimes the landlord and tenant having resolved the dispute locally between themselves. Sometimes it's because an initial contact from us is enough to provoke a resolution in itself. And so for a large part, there's a number of cases that don't get to the stage where we have formal mediation or a formal hearing. So last year we had over 2,700 hearings, and of those, 573 were appealed to our tribunals area. In terms of service times, and maybe one of the things that a lot of people know about the RTB or hear about the RTB is, oh, you're very slow, and that's a common thing that people have said. But actually, from 2008, we were taking a ridiculous amount of time. It was 18 months to wait for a dispute back in 2008, and that was obviously not acceptable. And since then, our resources have improved considerably, and with that, so have our service times. And now in 2016, you're talking about 2 to 3 months. At the moment, 75% of our cases are dealt with within 1 to 2 months in terms of disputes coming before us. We now also offer a free telephone mediation service, which Jeanette is going to talk a little bit about later. At the moment, in terms of that service, you're getting to a determination order by 4 weeks. So by the time the application is made to us and the resolution of the case is approximately 4 weeks. We know that maybe enforcement is in an area where some people have difficulty. So for the large majority of cases where we issue a determination order, most people comply with them. But there are a number of cases where people don't comply with the eventual determination order that is made. And in those cases, what's required is court enforcement. We know this, particularly for a number of people, can cause huge frustration for people in terms of how do we get to the courts, the cost of the court, how long it takes. At the moment, what we're trying to do, and what you'll see today, is we've left out a pact to try and help landlords and tenants take their own cases where they need to, as well as us concentrating now on re-looking at our model of enforcement to see, can we do more cases for less money so that we can try and get more cases through the system. So we're aware of the frustrations around that particular area. Just to more generally turn to the rental sector, and I think Tom talked about it earlier, you know, the rental sector, now we now have 1 in 5 now renting in the private rental sector, and we have the social housing on top of that. So it's a significant tenure type in Ireland now, you know, and that means that it's affecting a huge amount of people, a huge amount of tenants, but also in terms of landlords. And I suppose what I wanted to say around this is that we're aware that it's a particularly challenging time for tenants who are finding it difficult to find properties or are facing affordability issues, but also in terms of landlords who are having to cope with more and more change in terms of a regulatory front. We also know landlords are struggling, some of them financially, in terms of they took financing out in the peak times and are now struggling to repay some of that. So we're aware of the difficulties that are out there in that. And we also, I suppose, my key message in this is that for the rental sector to work, we need both landlords and tenants to be in it. And a lot of the time at the moment, we hear press and talk about the bad landlord or the bad tenant, and that's not helpful to anybody. What we actually need is landlord and tenants, happy landlords and happy tenants. And so that would be one of my priorities going forward, is to try and keep that understanding that in order to create tenancies, you need both sides of that party. And I return, I suppose, just to the vision, and just as I finish up here, of supporting a well-functioning rental sector and what can the RTB do to support that. In terms of my priorities in supporting that over the next while, it'll be to continue to improve our services. In particular, we'll be looking at our IT services, our web services. I've spoken to some of you today already about how you're interacting with us and that the website needs to be improved. So there's some of the things we're going to be working at. Our service times in terms of disputes, we're going to continue to improve. I've already spoken about the enforcement model. We're also going to focus on dispute prevention. Because actually, nobody's winning. By the time a case comes to us, nobody comes out happy. The key to it is actually education and awareness and people knowing about their rights and obligations so that disputes don't happen in the first place. So success for us is disputes, all of us, is disputes not coming to us in the first place. So we're going to concentrate on trying to ensure that more and more people know about what those rights and obligations are. And also concentrate on non-adversarial models, such as the mediation. So we're finding much more successful results in terms of people being happy with outcomes, whereby they're using that mediation service, where people don't have to come into conflict with another, and also we get the chance to try and nip things in the bud. So they're the kind of areas that we're going to be concentrating on, and also on data. So we don't have a role in policy making, but what we do have is we sit on an awful lot of data about the sector. And what we'll do is we will make sure that that data can be passed on to the powers that be so that there's informed policy making. So with that, I just wanted to say thank you. I hope you find the session today informative, and obviously we can look at questions at the end. Thanks a million.